Professor Oded Lifshitz from the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Cultures at Tel Aviv University is inviting you to join him to a journey following those who composed the historical descriptions in the Hebrew Bible.
The Untold Story of the Kingdom of Judah, Part E. The Untold Story about the Kingdom of Judah in the days of the biblical historiographers. Chapter 5. The Untold Story of Sennacherib's campaign and the fate of Jerusalem, the city that God had chosen. Sennacherib's campaign against the Kingdom of Judah, conducted in 701 BCE, was the most dramatic and significant event in the history of the Kingdom of Judah until the Babylonian destruction that came 115 years later. It left behind clear and well-dated layers of destructions, which became its archaeological hallmark, enabling archaeologists to separate pottery assemblages that date to the end of the 8th century BCE, which are found sealed under the destruction layers, from assemblages from the 7th century BCE, sometimes after a gap of several decades, which are located above the destruction layers. Historically, Sennacherib's campaign resulted in a severe blow to Judah, the exile of many residents, the destruction of the economy, and the severance of the lowlands from the kingdom after its territories were handed over to the kingdoms of Philistia and especially to the rule of the kingdom of Ekron. Assyrian control of Judah became tighter and the conditions of enslavement were made stricter. The economy had to be restored without the fertile and important lowlands region, which just a century prior to Sennacherib's campaign was integrated into the local economy. The area around Jerusalem reluctantly became more important to the life of the kingdom. An unknown number of exiles had concentrated who escaped from the periphery of the kingdom before, during, and after the Assyrian campaign, had settled in Jerusalem and its surroundings. But beyond all the immediate effects that Sennacherib's campaign had on Judah, another long-term, largely unpredictable and destructive long-term effect involved the ideological, theological, and historiographical realms. About 20 years after the destruction of the great and powerful kingdom of Israel, a destruction explained in Judah by the accumulated sin of the kings of Israel, who didn't understand that God was to be worshipped exclusively in Jerusalem and not in the temples of sin that were established in the kingdom of Israel, came the Assyrian campaign. Despite the terrible destruction of many cities, the exile and the heavy economic damage, the main memory of the campaign among Jerusalem's elite, 1, 2, and 3 generations later, was the memory of the miraculous sparing of Jerusalem, which stood its ground in the Assyrian attack and was not conquered. From this memory grew the idea of God's eternal promise to the city he had chosen, to the temple and the dynasty of kings in Jerusalem. This was the ideology that led, about a century later, to the rebellion in Babylon, as well as to the policy that resulted in the exile and total destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, and the house of David. A few people struggled with this idea, which prevailed in Jerusalem, and tried to convince others that the eternal promise was not unconditional. Jeremiah was one of these few. He also knew the belief in God's eternal promise, but his main claim was that this promise was conditional, conditioned by the existence of a sane political class that does not advocate for hopeless rebellions to believers in that eternal promise, who see it as an insurance certificate of sorts and adhere to the continuation of the rebellion until the end and at any cost. According to Jeremiah, these promises are also conditional on obeying God's commandments and law and maintaining a society of values in which the elite does not abuse its power for oppression, greed, and exploitation. This is the reason for the untold story of Sennacherib's campaign. The authors of the biblical historiography, as well as their readers, members of the Jerusalem elite, were well acquainted with history and knew what the terrible results of this campaign were. In the description of the campaign's history, a chronicle was inserted which briefly described what happened, so that the information about it was available. The chronicle included the heavy destruction, Hezekiah's surrender, and the enslavement of Judah. But the memory of all this faded in contrast with the memory of the miraculous salvation of Jerusalem and the ideas that grew among the Jerusalem elite about God's eternal promise to the city, to the temple, and to the Davidic dynasty. The light beam of memory illuminated the salvation of Jerusalem with a light that grew stronger and more focused as the years passed, as the sad results of the campaign faded gradually. In the days of Josiah, when Assyria retreated from the area and it seemed that Judah was about to return to the glory days of the united monarchy, Sennacherib's campaign served as a proof of the existence of God's eternal promise and was the clear symbol of this promise. This is the theme of this chapter about the untold story, or the double story that is told, emphasizing the idea of the eternal promise while blurring the terrible results of the campaign, Hezekiah's surrender, and Judah's continued enslavement to Assyria. But in order to understand what was left untold, one must start with what was told. We will access this by reconstructing history using the various sources on Sennacherib's campaign. With this reconstruction, we can then go back and examine the biblical text to find out what is included and, even more so, what was left out. In the 8th century BCE, Judah grew as a developed and mature kingdom, expanded the borders of its rule, mainly to the west, at the expense of the demolished kingdom of Gath, and established itself in the lowlands region, whose natural resources had become an important component in the kingdom's economy. Lachish was the secondary administrative center in Judah, and Jerusalem instituted its position as the capital and the central city in the kingdom. The area of the city grew and expanded to the western hill, its population gradually increased, and it was surrounded by strong walls. After the surrender of Ahaz to Tiglath-Pileser III in 732 BCE and Judah's enslavement to Assyria, there was a change in the administration of the kingdom and its economy, evidence of the transition from a local system with loose ties between the various tribes and regions to a centralized royal economy which improved its transportation and agricultural production. Under Assyrian pressure and with the encouragement and leadership of the local government in Judah, technological changes and improvements took place in the agricultural production facilities in Judah. Throughout the kingdom, the shekel weights became the standardized measurement used in the commerce and advanced the ability to monitor commerce and trade. At this stage, significant change also took place in the ceramic culture of Judah, which progressed from small-scale, unstandardized manufacture in local workshops to mass production in central workshop of standardized vessels, which were then distributed throughout the kingdom. Among these pottery vessels, which were mass produced with excellent uniformity in a single workshop and were distributed all over the kingdom, the oval storage jars were highly important. These are also referred to as the royal Judean storage jars or the Lamelech jars. The operation of the Lamelech stamp impressions on the handles of these jars was also part of the administration and economy that began to operate in Judah under the rule of Assyria, with Assyrian encouragement and perhaps even with the imperial pressure to increase agricultural production as part of the annual taxes that were imposed on Judah. The concentration of more than half of the Lamelech stamped jars in Lachish indicates the extent and conduct of this system and the lowlands' centrality in the economy of that period. This should be understood as part of the servitude arrangements established by the Assyrian rule in Judah when it became a vassal kingdom. The development in all areas reached its peak in the days of Hezekiah on the eve of the Assyrian campaign to Judah. As already discussed above in one of the previous chapters, I support the approach that establishes Hezekiah's ascension to the throne in 715 BCE, mainly based on the short chronistic description in the second book of Kings, chapter 18, verses 13 to 16, which will be discussed in further detail later in a few minutes. This description opens by determining the date of Sennacherib's campaign and summarizes its main point. I'm reading. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. End of quote. Given this statement, according to which Hezekiah came to power 14 years before the year 701 BCE, the chronological information provided about Hezekiah in the opening formula for the days of his reign in the second book of Kings, chapter 18, verses 1 to 3, according to which Hezekiah ascended to the throne in the third year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, seems problematic, since it requires us to assume that he came to power even before the destruction of the kingdom of Israel. Additionally, there is no information about most of his reign, and he died immediately after Sennacherib's campaign. And in any case, the date of Sennacherib's campaign does not coincide with the determination of the 14th year of Hezekiah's reign. Moreover, the similarity between the information given about Hezekiah and that given about Amaziah, the king Amaziah, who reigned in Judah 4 generations before Hezekiah, is very suspicious. Both kings are said to have ascended to the throne when they were 25 years old, and both are said to have reigned for 29 years, so they also died in the same age. Both of them are mentioned to have continued to reign for another 15 years after suffering severe defeat on the battlefields, after Amaziah suffered a defeat at the hands of the king Joash of Israel, who also captured him in Bet Shemesh and destroyed large parts of the walls of Jerusalem. It is said that in chapter 14, verse 17, Amaziah, son of Joash, king of Judah, lived 15 years after the death of Joash, son of Joachaz, king of Israel. End of quote. Similarly, after Hezekiah suffered a defeat in Sennacherib's campaign, after which he also fell ill with a serious illness, according to chapter 20, verse 1, he was told the following prophecy in chapter 20, verse 6. And I will add 15 years to your life. I will deliver you and this city out of the hand of the king of Assyria, and I will defend this city for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. But the similarities between the two kings don't end there, since the sons of Amaziah and Hezekiah both ascended to the throne after their father's death when they were very young and reigned for many, many years. According to his opening formula in the second book of Kings, chapter 15, verse 2, Uzziah, the son of Amaziah, I'm quoting, was 16 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. End of quote. Likewise, the opening formula for Menashe, Hezekiah's son, in chapter 21, verse 1, notes that Menashe was 12 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. In addition, it is said of both Amaziah and Hezekiah in similar language that before they were defeated on the battlefield by great and powerful kings, Amaziah at the hand of King Jehoash of Israel and Hezekiah at the hand of Sennacherib, king of Assyria, they won victories against local kings, small kings. In the second book of Kings, chapter 14, verse 7, it is said of Amaziah, and I'm quoting, he killed 10,000 Edomites in the valley of Salt and took Selah by storm. And in similar language, it is said of Hezekiah in chapter 18, verse 8, he smote the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory from watchtower to fortified city. End of quote. These similarities between the descriptions of the days of Amaziah and of Hezekiah seem too tight to be coincidental. And the internal contradiction between the years of Hezekiah's reign in the chronicles of Sennacherib's campaign and the synchronistic calculation indicates, in my opinion, that the biblical historiographers found within the prophetic story, which is also preserved in the book of Isaiah, the information about the king's illness and Isaiah's prophecy. And in it, they also found a description of adding 15 years of reign after the defeat and after the illness. They found a parallel for this in the story of Amaziah. They wrote the story, since the historiographers themselves emphasized the calculation of the continuation of Amaziah's reign in their own description. With this in mind, the historiographers created the broader parallel between Hezekiah and Amaziah and even formalized and intensified it with the ultimate purpose of emphasizing the difference between the kings. Namely, in the days of Amaziah, Jerusalem was conquered, the king was captured, and its walls were breached. While in Hezekiah's day, the city was spared, a central, essential theme within Deuteronomistic ideology. Furthermore, the biblical historiographer also added a double positive theological assessment formula for Hezekiah in chapter 18, verse 3 and then 5 and 6, where if the information about the cultic reform carried out by the king was added after the first positive assessment in verse 4, then the comment about the rebellion in Assyria was added after the second formula in verse 7. I'm quoting, he rebelled against the king of Assyria and would not serve him. End of quote. The contrasting of Amaziah with Hezekiah is one part of the historiographical description. As noted, while the conquest of Jerusalem occurs in the days of Amaziah, Hezekiah is described as the one in whose days Jerusalem was saved and the Assyrians failed to conquer it. To this, we can also add the contrast between Hezekiah and his father, Ahaz, who is given a negative theological evaluation formula which was especially tailored for him from the collection of Deuteronomistic expressions, mainly due to the memory of his voluntary enslavement to the king of Assyria. Once again, this voluntary enslavement contrasts with Hezekiah, who rebelled against the king of Assyria and refused to serve him, and thus receives a positive theological evaluation formula like no one else. I'm quoting, he trusted in Yahweh, the God of Israel, so that there was none like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor among those who were before him. For he held fast to Yahweh. He didn't depart from the following him, but kept the commandments which Yahweh commanded Moses. All of the above hints at the central role that Sennacherib's campaign played in memory and in the development of the Deuteronomistic ideology, to which the actual events that took place in the military campaign itself are almost meaningless. To reconstruct these events, we can use the Assyrian sources covering the historical background to the rebellion and the Assyrian military campaign to the southern Levant in general and to Judah in particular. Hezekiah's rebellion in Assyria must be linked to the events of 705 BCE. According to the Assyrian sources, in this year, Sargon II embarked on a campaign to the land of Tabal in eastern Anatolia, aiming to punish tribal groups that had invaded the area. The Assyrian army was surprised, apparently while encamped in a rear camp on the way to the battlefield. The camp was almost completely destroyed, and the Assyrian army scattered. King Sargon was killed in battle, and his body was taken. Thus, he is the only Assyrian king who was not taken to be buried in Assyria. Rebellions immediately broke out all over the empire, starting from the areas in eastern Anatolia, which were close to the battlefield, through Babylon, where Merodach Baladan the Chaldean, Marduk Apla Idina II in Babylon, had been anointed king and was supported by the king of Elam, and ending with a rebellion in the southwestern part of the empire, which Hezekiah headed and which was supported by the Egyptian Kushite dynasty, the 25th dynasty. Since the rebel kingdoms were small and weak, and they had no chance of facing the Assyrian in face-to-face battle in the open field, they, and especially Hezekiah, king of Judah, apparently adopted the tactic of fortifying the main cities in the kingdom and with the hope of exhausting the Assyrian army in long siege wars. For this, Hezekiah needed Egyptian backing. He may have hoped that the recruitment of the Egyptian army to war against Assyria during its siege on the cities of Judah would cause the Assyrians to retreat. There were contacts between Judah and Egypt that are also echoed in the prophecies of Isaiah in chapter 18, verses 1 to 6, in chapter 30, verses 1 to 5 and 6 to 7, and also in chapter 31, verses 1 to 3, who condemned these contacts. It is also possible that negotiations were conducted with Babylon, which also rebelled at that time, and this may be the background to the visit of the delegation sent by Merodach Baladan, the new king in Babylon, about which a prophetic story is preserved in the second book of Kings, chapter 20, verses 12 to 19. Isaiah had also condemned the collaboration with Babylon, and a prophecy of disaster about Judah's upcoming exile to Babylon was later incorporated into his words. Hezekiah also forced the cities on his western border to join the alliance, which relates to the information in the Assyrian documents about the rebellion that broke out in Ekron, and the story that the rebels delivered Padi, the king of Ekron, into the hands of Hezekiah, who imprisoned him in Jerusalem. We also know from Assyrian sources that Rukibtu, the king of Ashkelon, was removed from his throne. Crowned in his place was Tzidka, apparently a member of the royal family who supported cooperation with Hezekiah in the rebellion. Perhaps as part of the negotiation with Egypt, Gaza also joined the alliance of rebel kingdoms, which might have enabled Egyptian military assistance during the war against Assyria. We can assume that in the 3 years between the rebellion and the Assyrian army waging war against the alliance of rebel kingdoms, Hezekiah had prepared his kingdom for the upcoming war. From the archaeological research, it is difficult to date the establishment and the construction of fortifications, water reservoirs, and various buildings, but it is likely that the kingdom's border cities were strengthened and fortified. Enough troops were gathered in them for the expected Assyrian siege, and the army was equipped and organized accordingly. We can also assume that the southwestern hill of Jerusalem, where the Jewish quarter and the Armenian quarter are located today, was also fortified, although it is impossible to date with certainty the construction of the wide wall discovered in Avigad excavation in the Jewish quarter, since the wall passed over houses that were cleared for the fortification route. It seems that there is evidence of the expansion of Jerusalem to this area even before the rebellion in the days of Ahaz and Hezekiah. If so, then, the fortification of the western hill might not have been constructed hastily during the 3 years of the rebellion, but even earlier. In the closing formula of Hezekiah's reign, one comment was added, verse 20, according to which the rest of the deeds of Hezekiah and all he might, and how he made the pool and the conduit and brought water into the city. Researchers no longer attribute to Hezekiah the hewing of the Siloam Tunnel, a project whose hewing couldn't have been completed in such a short time, and which seems to be related to the process of the city's expansion to the western hill and the bringing of water to a place that is more accessible and available and central to the city's residents. Yet, the memory of Hezekiah and the water constructions in Jerusalem is also preserved in the second book of Chronicles and in the book of Sirach. And important testimony to this is also preserved in Isaiah 22, verses 9 to 11, where the fortification of Jerusalem is also described, which took a heavy toll as many houses were destroyed and removed in the process. I'm quoting. And you saw that the breaches of the city of David were many, and you collected the waters of the lower pool, and you counted the houses of Jerusalem, and you broke down the houses to fortify the wall. You made a reservoir between the two walls for the water of the old pool. End of quote. It seems logical that Hezekiah fortified Jerusalem and in the process also strengthened the city's water system. But in terms of the historiographical descriptions, there are no clear details for all this. Moreover, it is problematic to rely on the later descriptions in the book of Chronicles, second book of Chronicles, chapter 32, verse 5, which appear more like a logical completion of the historical description based on a reading of the information in the book of Kings. The Assyrian campaign started in the 3rd year of Sennacherib's campaign, 701 BC. Various Assyrian sources have been preserved about this campaign, the most detailed of which is the Annals of Sennacherib, which, although written as an official expression of royal ideology, though fixed formula, and shouldn't be considered an objective and realistic historical description, still contains a lot of information about the campaign. The inscription is arranged in a geographical order with a coastal area described first, and then the inland area, and then also from north to south. Giving this organization of the annals, clearly Judah is at the end of the description since it is both for inland and to the south. The reconstruction of the campaign reveals that the Assyrian army first reached the Phoenician coast, from which King Luli of Sidon fled, and according to another Assyrian inscription, he fled to Cyprus, where he died. At this point, all the coastal cities that belonged to the kingdom of Sidon surrendered, up to the region of Acre, and many other kings who realized that they stood no chance against the Assyrians came to surrender before Sennacherib. The inscription mentioned all these kings, starting with the kings in the northern coastal region, continuing to the kings in the southern coastal region, and ending with the kings of the Transjordan. 3 kingdoms did not surrender to the Assyrians, and from that moment onward, the description of the campaign focused on them: Ashkelon, Ekron, and Judah. Tzidka, king of Ashkelon, was exiled, and the king who had preceded him was rethroned by the Assyrians. The city was enslaved, and cities under its rule, mainly in the area of the Yarkon, including Bet Dagon, Jaffa, Bnei Brak, and Azor, were conquered. This was the stage when the people of Ekron were frightened by the rebellion and their collaboration with the kingdom of Judah, but it was already too late. According to the annals, I'm quoting, the leaders and dignitaries of Ekron, who placed iron handcuff on Padi, their king, who was a vassal of the land of Assyria, and criminally handed him over to Hezekiah the Judean, were now frightened by the criminal act they had committed. End of quote. After a battle against the Egyptians held on the plain of the city of El Teke, in the area of present-day Yavne, where the Assyrians inflicted a severe defeat on the Egyptian army, Ekron was also captured, the leaders of the rebellion were killed or captured, and order in the city was restored. After Hezekiah's surrender, King Padi of Ekron was also taken from the city and restored to the throne, with the aim of restoring stability and order to the city and regaining its loyalty. Judah's fate was bitter, as described in the annals, and I'm reading. As for Hezekiah the Judean, who didn't submit to my yoke, on his 46 fortified cities, walled cities, and on the innumerable small cities around them, I put a siege and trapped them with beaten earth ramps, mighty battering rams brought near to the wall. With the attack of my foot soldiers, breaches, and siege machines, I conquered them. I took out 200,150 people, young and old, male and female, horses, mules, donkeys, camels, cattle, and sheep, without number, and counted them as spoil. End of quote. The Assyrian annals admit that Jerusalem was not conquered, and the description uses a fixed formula of this purpose, which compensates that the failure. I'm quoting, he himself, I locked him within Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. I surrounded him with earthworks and made it unthinkable for him to exit by the city gates. The punishment for the rebellion Judah was severe. I'm quoting, his cities which I had despoiled, I cut off from his land and gave them to Mitinti, king of Ashdod, Padi, king of Ekron, and Tzilibel, king of Gaza, and thus I diminished his land. I imposed dues and gifts for my lordship upon him, in addition to the former tribute, their yearly payment. End of quote. As part of the compensation for the fact that the city of Jerusalem was not captured, the annals describe the following, and I'm quoting. He, Hezekiah, was overwhelmed by the awesome splendor of my lordship, and he sent me after my departure to Nineveh, my royal city, his elite troops and his best soldiers, which he had brought in as reinforcement to strengthen Jerusalem, with 30 talents of gold, 800 talents of silver, choice antimony, large blocks of carnelian, beds inlaid with ivory, elephant hides, ivory, ebony wood, boxwood, multicolored garments, garments of linen, wool dyed red purple and blue purple, vessels of copper, iron, bronze, and tin, chariots, siege shields, lances, armor, daggers for the belt, bow and arrows, countless trapping and implements of war, together with his daughters, his palace women, his male and female singers. He also dispatched his messenger to deliver the tribute and to conduct an enslavement ceremony. End of quote. Additional information also comes from the reliefs discovered in the throne room of Sennacherib's palace in Nineveh, which give a detailed visual description of the conquest of Lachish. Information is also preserved in Sennacherib's letter to God, additionally called the Azekah inscription, which tells about the direction of the Assyrians' army's incursion from the west to east, with Azekah comprising Sennacherib's first destination. And I'm reading: Ashur, my lord, encouraged me, and against the land of Judah I marched. In the course of my campaign, the tribute of the kings of, and here something is broken, with the might of Ashur, my lord, the province of Hezekiah of Judah, like, and here broken again, the city of Azekah, his stronghold, which is between my border and the land of Judah, something broken, like the nest of the eagle located on a mountain ridge, like pointed iron daggers without number reaching high to heaven. Its walls were strong and rivaled the highest mountains to the mere sight, as if from the sky appears its head. By means of beaten earth ramps, mighty battering rams brought near to the work of something broken, with the attack by foot soldiers, my warriors, something broke. They had seen the approach of my cavalry, and they had heard the roar of the mighty troops of the god Ashur, and their hearts became afraid. The city of Azekah I besieged, I captured, I carried off its spoil, I destroyed, I devastated, I burned with fire. From the Assyrian sources, it appears that Judah suffered a heavy blow from the Assyrian army, as the focus of the war was in the lowlands, and in particularly in the cities of Lachish and Azekah. These sources also indicate that Jerusalem was not conquered, and that Hezekiah was enslaved to Assyria and paid heavy tribute, perhaps in return for the Assyrians not conquering the city of Jerusalem. A description parallel to the content of the information found in the Assyrian sources is found in the second book of Kings, chapter 18, verses 13 to 16, a text characterized by a short and to the point chronicle, which apparently reflects the course and results of Sennacherib's campaign, as recorded in Jerusalem during the campaign or immediately after it. according to this chronicle, and I'm reading. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. And Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, I have done wrong. Withdraw from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will bear. And the king of Assyria required of Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. And Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of Yahweh and in the treasuries of the king's house. At that time, Hezekiah stripped the gold from the doors of the temple of Yahweh and from the doorposts which Hezekiah, king of Judah, had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria. End of quote. The parallels between the Assyrian annals and the biblical description also include the amount of gold that Hezekiah paid, 30 talents of gold. Although, in contrast to the 300 talents of silver mentioned in the biblical description, the Assyrian annals include 800 talents of silver, perhaps an accidental or intentional recording error on the part of one of the chronicles. Adding to this chronistic account, which corresponds with the Assyrian texts and agrees with Hezekiah's submission to Sennacherib, a prophetic story was written near the same time, after the end of the Assyrian campaign, centered on the prophet Isaiah, and was inserted by the biblical historiographer immediately after the chronistic account. And we can find it in the second book of Kings, chapter 18, verse 17, to chapter 19, verse 9a, the first part of verse 9. And its end can be found in chapter 19, verses 36 and 37. In this story, the echoes of the harsh results of the war are still preserved, presented as a long speech by the Rabshakeh, the cup-bearer in Akkadian, a title given to the one of the senior ministers in the kingdom of Assyria. And he was sent from Lachish by the king of Assyria along with Turtanu in Akkadian, a title meaning commander-in-chief, the most important minister, second only to the king, and the Rab Saris, Rab Shareshi in Akkadian, means chief of officers. The main goal of the speech of the Rabshakeh is to present the mighty power of the Assyrians and the fact that the king of Judah had no chance to withstand their attack. The Rabshakeh's speech opened with the declaration on behalf of the king of Assyria in verses 19 and 20, and I can quote, "Thus said the great king, king of Assyria, what confidence is this wherein you trusted? You said, but they are but vain words. There is counsel and strength for the war. Now, on whom do you trust that you have rebelled against me?" End of quote. And at this point, Rabshakeh enumerates the elements whereby Hezekiah could have trusted in his rebellion in Assyria and reject them one by one. He begins with the Egyptians in verse 21 that are presented as, and I quote, "the bruised reed whereon if a man lean, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, unto all that trust on him." And then he moved to the God of Israel, who is presented as having no power to guard his own places of worship that were destroyed. And in verse 22, he said, "He whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed." And then he moved also to Judah's military power that is weak and cannot stand against the Assyrian army. And this is in verse 23. And I quote, "Come now, give pledge to my master, the king of Assyria, and I will give you 2,000 horses, if you are able on your part to set riders upon them." And then Rabshakeh presents the Assyrian campaign as the fulfillment of the will of the God of Israel. And this is in verse 25. Is it without Yahweh that I have come up against this place to destroy it? Yahweh said to me, the king of Assyria, "Go up against this land and destroy it." According to the story, Hezekiah's messengers understand the enormous moral damage that these words of the Assyrians are causing to those besieged in Jerusalem, and turn to the Rabshakeh with a request. And this is in verse 26. "Pray, speak to your servants in the Aramaic language, for we understand it. Do not speak to us in the language of Judah, in the ears of the people who are on the wall." In response, the Rabshakeh deliberately turns to all the people, and this is in verses 27 to 35, and attacks Hezekiah, who makes false promises to the people that he unable to keep. From the point of view of the Assyrians, there is no mercy for the rebellious Jerusalem. And the alternative that the Assyrians offer to death and destruction is immediate surrender and exile, while promising that those who surrender will be exiled to a good land. I can read from verse 32. "Until I come and take you away to a land like your own land, a land of grain and wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olive trees and honey, that you may live and not die." End of quote. The Rabshakeh explicitly attacks Hezekiah's promise in verse 32. "And do not listen to Hezekiah when he misleads you by saying, 'Yahweh will deliver us.'" And the confidence in God's salvation is attacked in verse 35. "Who among all the gods of the countries have delivered their countries out of my hand, that Yahweh should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand?" Hezekiah does not play a significant role in this story, despite the emphasis on his strength and the discipline that existed among the people, according to chapter 18, verse 36. "But the people were silent and answered him not a word, for the king's command was, 'Do not answer him.'" His main role in the story is his response in chapter 19, verse 1, and I'm quoting. "When King Hezekiah heard it, he rent his cloth and covered himself with a sackcloth and went into the house of Yahweh." And Hezekiah sending the delegation to the prophet Isaiah, and this is described in verses 3 and 4. They said to him, "Thus said Hezekiah, this day is a day of distress, of rebuke, and of disgrace. Children have come to the birth, and there is no strength to bring them forth. It may be that Yahweh your God heard all the words of the Rabshakeh, whom his master, the king of Assyria, has sent to mock the living God, and will rebuke the words which Yahweh your God has heard. Therefore, lift up your prayer for the remnant that is left." End of quote. The prophet's response is short and clear, and it contains disdain for the messengers of the king of Assyria who came to Jerusalem, and this is in verse 6. "Say to your master, thus said Yahweh, do not be afraid because of the words that you have heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have reviled me. The prophetic message is sharp. The king of Assyria will hear a rumor that will arouse great anxiety to him, which will cause him to return to his land." And this is in verse 7. "Behold, I will put a spirit in him, so that he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land. And I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. End of quote. The prophecy is soon fulfilled because, according to the first part of verse 9, the rumor about the Egyptian king's military campaign does come. I'm quoting, and when the king heard concerning Tirhaka, king of Cush, behold, he has set out the fight against you. Then, according to the original ending of the story in the second book of Kings, chapter 19, verses 36-37, Sennacherib returned to his land where he was murdered by his two sons. I'm quoting, then Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went home and dwelt at Nineveh. And as he was worshipping in the house of Nisroch, his god, Adramelech and Sharetzer, his sons, slew him with a sword and escaped into the land of Ararat. And Esarhaddon, his son, reigned in his stead. End of quote. The end of the story explains the meaning of the sudden and incomprehensible Assyrian withdrawal from the siege of Jerusalem. It seems to imply that Judah won the war and didn't remain enslaved to the Assyrians. In this ending, there is a parallel to the prophetic story about the sudden and incomprehensible withdrawal of the Arameans from the siege of Samaria, as told in the second book of Kings, chapter 6, verse 24, to chapter 7, verse 20. And of course, the explanation given is the divine miracle. Perhaps here too, the source is in a prophetic story, and thus the focus is on the prophet. The role of the king is vague and marginal, and the miracle is a divine intervention. We can assume that here too, the biblical historiographers had a prophetic source that they inserted after the chronistic source, and the message of the story, as well as its ending, corresponded to their interest and the Deuteronomistic ideology of ignoring Judah's enslavement to Assyria, blurring the century of Assyrian rule in Judah, presenting of God's power in his defense of Jerusalem, and warning against surrendering to great forces coming up against Judah. Another story was inserted into this historiographical literary system in a later period. I'm talking about the second book of Kings, chapter 19, verse 9b, the second part of verse 9 to 35. Apparently, it was added only after the destruction of Jerusalem and during the post-exilic times. Clearly, the authors of this second story knew the first story well, interpreted it in their own way, and sought to refine its messages and adapt them to the period in which they lived, acted, and wrote. This story opens at exactly the same point as the first story, adding the word again. So he sent messengers again to Hezekiah, saying, and there it interrupts the end of the first story by describing the rumor that reached the king of Assyria about the military campaign of the Egyptian king. This is in chapter 19, verse 9a, and separates it from the end in verses 36-37 about the return of the king of Assyria to Nineveh and his murder by his two sons, while adding before the original end, before verse 35, what seems to later readers to be missing in the first story, a miraculous blow from God's angel to the Assyrian army. I'm quoting. And that night the angel of Yahweh went forth and slew 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when men arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies. End of quote. This miraculous blow completed the end of the story and added the reason for the sudden retreat of the Assyrian army. In the second story, The speech by the Assyrian king's messengers is greatly reduced into 4 verses of summary in chapter 19, verses 10 to 13, which concentrates the message from the first story and copies its main points. Later, a long and moving description of Hezekiah's prayer in the temple is added in verses 14 to 19. The image of the king is glorified in this story. Indeed, he is the figure that connects Sennacherib's message, which he receives through his messengers written on a scroll, and through a direct appeal to God after he takes the scroll to the temple, unfolds it before God, and offers him a prayer. His prayer is formulated in Deuteronomistic language and includes a direct appeal to God, which ends with a request. I'm quoting: "Now therefore, O Yahweh our God, save us, I beseech thee, out of his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you, O Yahweh, are God alone." Hezekiah's prayer is immediately answered by the prophet Isaiah, and this is described in the second book of Kings, chapter 19, verse 20. Then Isaiah, the son of Amoz, sent to Hezekiah, saying, "Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, your prayer to me about Sennacherib, king of Assyria, I have heard." In the center of the second story, Isaiah's words are presented in a considerable expansion of his words in the first story, and I'm talking about verses 20 to 34, and they include words of mockery and contempt for the Assyrians and 2 prophecies about the end of Sennacherib. As mentioned, the mockery of Sennacherib is at the center of Isaiah's words, and I can read from verses 21 and 22. This is the word that Yahweh has spoken concerning him. She despises you. She scorns you, the virgin daughter of Zion. She wags her head behind you, the daughter of Jerusalem. Whom have you mocked and reviled? Against whom have you raised your voice and haughtily lifted your eyes? Against the Holy One of Israel. End of quote. These things appear to be a late expansion of Isaiah's words from the first story, while being closely acquainted with the Rabshakeh's speech from the first story and directly answering these words. In the words of Isaiah, we also find the use of expressions and concepts that are more appropriately dated to the days of the Babylonian exile and related to the words of the prophet from this period known as Second Isaiah, such as the mention of the surviving remnant of the house of Judah in verse 30, and "For out of Jerusalem shall go forth a remnant, and out of Mount Zion a band of survivors," and this is in verse 31. Scholars have already shown that the addition of the names of the places that were not saved from the kings of Assyria in verse 12, I'm kidding. "Have the gods of the nations delivered them, the nation which my fathers destroyed, Gozan, Haran, Retsef, and the people of Eden who were in Tal-Etzer," is related to the conquests by the Babylonian kings Palasar and Nebuchadnezzar. Perhaps these places were known to the Babylonian exiles who were deported from Judah and lived near some of these places in Babylonia. In any case, this addition could not have been written before the Babylonian period. The conclusion that emerged from this is that the biblical historiographers, who knew what the dire results of Sennacherib's campaign were, found it important to dim the memory of Judah's enslavement to Assyria after this campaign. Therefore, despite the information they had about the terrible destruction of many cities, the exiles, and the heavy economic damage, The main memory they sought to perpetuate in the description of the history of Judah was the memory of the miraculous rescue of Jerusalem, which withstood attack by the Assyrian army unconquered. This memory was the seed sown, from which grew the idea of God's eternal promise to his chosen city, to the temple, and to the dynasty of kings in Jerusalem. To achieve this goal, after the chronistic source, which briefly and dryly describes the results of the campaign and the enslavement of Hezekiah, they added a prophetic story that they had, which was written sometime after this campaign, perhaps even in the early days of King Menashe, but still at a time when the memory of the Assyrian campaign was fresh and its dire consequences were still well remembered. In this story, the character of King Hezekiah was de-emphasized. The Assyrian threat was emphasized in the words of Sennacherib's messengers. And the great fear in the people was described along with the miraculous ending of the affair. The end of the story emphasizes the Assyrian withdrawal and leads readers to conclude that slavery to Assyria did not continue after that. The prophetic story played an important role in shaping the memory of the miraculous rescue of Jerusalem, which withstood the Assyrian attack unconquered. The memory of the terrible destruction caused by the Assyrians in Judah deemed in contrast to the memory of the miraculous rescue of Jerusalem and the ideas that grew among the Jerusalem elite about God's eternal promise to the city, to the temple, and to the Davidic dynasty. According to the rebuke of Sennacherib's messengers and Isaiah's answer, this story played an important role in the formation of the notion of God's eternal promise to his chosen city, to the temple, and to the dynasty of the kings in Jerusalem, a greatly important eternal promise in the days of Josiah and at the time when the Deuteronomistic descriptions were written. It seems that during the Babylonian exile, another layer was added to this story, which further increased the importance attributed to the figure of the prophet and to God's control over history. Perhaps this story is part of an editorial layer of the Deuteronomistic historiography that emphasized the prophet's place in history and their importance. In any case, the untold story of Sennacherib's campaign, which was one of the decisive events in the history of Judah, is an example of how history is a tool and historical memory is like clay in the hands of the potter, from which they can create any form they want by emphasizing, hiding, and diverting the message to where they want it directed. In the next chapter, we'll deal with the most untold story about one of the kings of Judah, King Menashe, who reigned longer than any of the kings of Judah during the time in which Judah recovered from the severe blow of Sennacherib's campaign, flourished and prospered. Yet, nothing is told about him and his days except for a broad description of the cultic scenes of his era. This is the most extreme example of an untold story, even more extreme than the partial omission of the results of Sennacherib's campaign, particularly since the words were written very close to Menashe's lifetime, when the events and history of the time period were well known to both the historiographers and to the target audience. There were good reasons for this omission from the perspective of the authors of the biblical descriptions, which we'll try to understand in the next chapter. It will be very interesting. See you in the next chapter.